I have spent years sitting at the bedsides of people who are nearing their final breath, and you start to see patterns that don't always make sense at first. I remember one afternoon in a quiet corner room where a daughter had been holding her father's hand for nearly 24 hours. He was deep in that heavy, unresponsive sleep that usually signals the very end. The room felt still, almost frozen, until his eyes suddenly snapped open with a sharp, piercing focus. It wasn't the vacant stare we usually see. He looked directly at her, his mind suddenly as clear as a summer morning. For a brief interval, he was truly there, recognizing her face and the space around him in a way that seemed impossible just moments before. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady, as he told her that everything was finally resolved. Then, just as quickly as the light had arrived, he drifted back into silence, leaving the room heavy with a new kind of mystery. In that moment, the daughter's face flooded with a sudden, desperate hope that a miracle was unfolding right before her eyes. It is the most difficult part of my job because I know this sudden spark isn't a sign of recovery or the body finding its way back to health. Instead, it is a hidden sequence of the dying process that almost no one is truly prepared to witness. We are going to investigate why the body gathers every last bit of energy for one final, purposeful connection just minutes before the end. The air in the room shifts instantly when that spark of life returns, and you can feel the collective intake of breath from everyone watching. To the family, it feels like a heavy curtain has been lifted, and for a heartbeat, they believe the nightmare is ending and their loved one is finally winning the battle. They start whispering about turning a corner or the fever breaking, reaching for a hope that is as natural as breathing itself. But as I stand there, checking the monitors and the shallow rise of the chest, I see the confusion in their eyes start to collide with a terrifying question. Is this a miracle, or is something much more mysterious happening under the surface? You have to wonder how a brain that has been shutting down for days, struggling for every drop of oxygen, can suddenly find the strength to compose a perfect, lucid thought. It defies everything we are taught about how the body fails, appearing almost like a surge of electricity in a dying bulb that should have stayed dark. This is the moment where the medical and the spiritual seem to blur into one, leaving us to grapple with a profound inconsistency. If the organs are stopping, where is this sudden, sharp energy coming from? It feels less like a recovery and more like a final, urgent message being broadcast from a station that is about to go off the air forever. In those quiet seconds following the patient's brief return, the silence that settles back over the room is heavier than it was before. The family looks at me with wide, searching eyes, silently begging for a confirmation that their father or mother is coming back to them for good. It is heartbreaking to witness, because this clarity often feels more real than the sickness itself, making it nearly impossible to believe that the end is actually closer than ever. We find ourselves caught in a strange tension between what we see and what we know to be true. Why does the body choose this exact moment to wake up? And what is it trying to achieve before it finally lets go? Before this moment of clarity arrives, the room is usually filled with the heavy sounds of the body's final transition. The breathing patterns change significantly, becoming irregular with long, agonizing pauses that make everyone in the room hold their own breath in sympathy. The patient is often miles away, their skin becoming cool, and their presence fading into a deep, unreachable state of unresponsiveness. It feels as though the body is already half gone, leaving behind a physical shell that no longer reacts to a familiar touch or a whispered name. But then, the heavy stillness is suddenly broken by something that feels like a profound biological glitch, where the ragged breaths smooth out for a few seconds, as if the body found a hidden reserve of fuel. This is when the gaze happens, and it is unlike any other look a human being can give. Usually, when someone is this close to the end, their eyes are glassy or fixed on a distant point. But in this specific moment, their eyes suddenly track motion with intent. They don't just open, they lock onto a loved one's face with a level of recognition that should be impossible for a brain struggling for oxygen. I have watched patients who haven't moved in days suddenly reach out a hand, their fingers moving with a precision that vanished weeks ago. It looks exactly like a sudden recovery, but if you look at the monitors, the heart isn't actually getting stronger. It is quietly beginning its final descent. It is a haunting contradiction that leaves even the most seasoned nurses standing in silence. You are witnessing a body that is objectively failing, with vital organs shutting down and blood pulling away from the extremities. Yet the mind seems to have just hit a deliberate reset button. It is as if the person is standing on a threshold, looking back one last time to ensure everything is in its right place before crossing over. We often call this a surge, but that clinical term fails to capture the weight of the experience. What is truly mysterious is how purposeful it feels, leading to the one question that defines this phenomenon. How can the mind be at its most powerful when the body is at its weakest? When this sudden surge happens, the atmosphere in the room often flips from heavy silence to a frantic, whispered panic. Families see that sharp look in the eyes or a sudden trembling reach of a hand and immediately assume their loved one is in deep distress. They ask me if the pain is returning or if the body is fighting a losing battle against some invisible agony. It looks like a struggle to stay, but this is exactly where our intuition leads us in the wrong direction. What looks like a frantic fight is actually the most focused part of the entire transition. We are so conditioned to fear the end that we mistake the body's final, organized effort for a sign of suffering. But if you watch closely, the tension often leaves their face entirely during these brief seconds. This isn't a glitch in the system or a failure of medicine. It is the body elegantly clearing the slate for one last moment of presence. It is a release, not a struggle. If this isn't a cry for help or a sign of pain, then why does the brain suddenly ignite like a dying star? We often assume that the body is simply falling apart in a random, chaotic way. But this moment of clarity suggests there is a specific, hidden logic at work. It is as if the person is being given a final, temporary pass to step back into their own life one last time. But the question remains, why does the body save its most powerful energy for the very moment it is supposed to be shutting down? What we are actually seeing is not a chaotic breakdown, but a very specific biological rhythm that the body enters as it prepares to let go. It often starts with the breathing, which shifts into a pattern of deep inhales followed by long, silent pauses. To a family watching, it looks like their loved one is gasping or struggling for air. But the reality is quite different. The brain is simply recalibrating its needs, moving into a steady, predictable pace that signals the physical engine is winding down. But what happens next with the skin tells an even more revealing story. You might notice the hands and feet becoming quite cool to the touch, or turning a soft, mottled purple color. It looks as though the person is freezing, which often causes families to rush for more blankets. But this is actually a brilliant act of biological prioritization. The heart is intentionally pulling blood away from the extremities to keep the core and the brain fueled for these final, precious moments. This is exactly why that sudden surge of clarity is physically possible. The body is sacrificing its outer shell to give the mind one last spark. This peak in consciousness isn't a random glitch. It is the final stage of a highly organized sequence. Think of it like a candle that flickers with surprising brightness right before the wick finally runs out of wax. Chemically, the body may be releasing a final flood of neurochemicals that briefly clears the clouds of illness or organ failure. We see this same sequence happen over and over again, regardless of the specific disease. It is a universal biological script that gives the person a small window to be present. But why does it happen exactly when everything else is stopping? When you combine the slowing breath, the changing skin, and this sudden mental clarity, you realize we aren't watching a collapse. We are witnessing a highly orchestrated exit. It is as if the body has a final checklist it needs to complete before it can truly find peace. Most people miss these signs because they are naturally blinded by the fear of the unknown. But once you understand this pattern, that fear starts to transform into a sense of profound understanding. It becomes a map for the most significant journey a human being will ever take. I remember a patient named Arthur, who had been in a deep, heavy state of unresponsiveness for nearly 2 full days. His daughter sat by the window, her spirit exhausted after hours of watching his shallow, ragged breathing that seemed to stumble over itself. The room felt like it was already morning, filled with the stale air of a life that was slowly withdrawing into a place we could no longer reach. There was no movement, no recognition, just the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the clock. Then, the atmosphere shifted with a suddenness that made my heart skip. Arthur's eyes, which had been closed and sunken, suddenly opened with a clarity that felt almost electric. He didn't look confused or lost. He turned his head slowly and locked eyes with his daughter, his gaze sharper than it had been in years. He reached out a hand that hadn't moved in 48 hours, and whispered, "Now everything is resolved." It wasn't a mumble, it was a deliberate, perfectly formed sentence. The reaction was instantaneous. His daughter gasped, her face illuminating with a desperate, radiant hope as she clutched his hand, convinced the miracle she'd prayed for had finally arrived. She started talking about what they would do when he got stronger, but I had to stand there in the shadows, holding the weight of a different truth. While she saw a beginning, I saw the final, brilliant flicker of a candle before the wick disappears. It wasn't the body healing, it was the soul finishing its business. Just minutes after that intense connection, Arthur drifted back into that quiet sleep, and the room returned to its heavy stillness. But something was different now. The tension that had lined his face for weeks was completely gone, replaced by a profound, smooth calmness. His daughter was weeping, yet she noticed it too, the way he seemed to have finally let go of a heavy burden. This wasn't a chaotic breakdown. It was a purposeful, organized exit that left everyone in the room changed forever. We spend so much of our lives fearing this exact moment, treating it like a chaotic collapse or a battle lost. But what if we looked at Arthur and hundreds of others like him, not as victims of a failing system, but as people completing a highly specialized task? Those cool hands and the erratic breathing are not signs of a struggle. They are the body's way of focusing its remaining light on the mind's final connection. When you stop seeing the end as a failure, you see a quiet triumph. It's a beautiful, hidden logic. That sudden spark of clarity, the one that breaks a family's heart with false hope, isn't meant to be a trick. It is a bridge. It's the body's way of ensuring that the person isn't leaving in a cloud of confusion, but with a sense of completion. This transition is much more organized and peaceful than we ever imagined, designed to lead us toward a stillness that is earned, not forced. Understanding this removes the sharp edge of the terror. We are built to say goodbye with dignity. In the end, we aren't just watching a life fade. We are witnessing a person finally finding their way home. It's a transition that carries its own kind of grace, one that reminds us how deeply we are connected until the very last breath. If you've ever sat in that silence or seen that final spark, please share your story in the comments. We are all learning how to walk each other home, and your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. It's how we find peace together.